I'm Daun Kauffman, an educator in North Philadelphia for 14 years now. I'd like to thank the Council for the hearings, for your stamina, for your engagement. I've been in much different hearings with the SRC. And I'd like to thank Allison McDowell for inviting me. My component of the discussion is, I don't think has been touched on directly yet, so we'll end on something unique. My component is childhood trauma, the power of the prevalence, and the price. One of my students, Danny, sent me. And if we were here at midnight, it was only us three, I would still be here for Danny. There's no better use of my time or energy than to give Danny a voice. All those in Danny's story are real. From an earlier school, only the names are changed. I do have a couple of slides with the effect of testing on trauma-impacted children, and the effect of trauma on testing. They interact. It's all neuroscience and public health research that doesn't see much light of day so far. But the point is, high-stakes testing results are predictable. The data says that children with unaddressed trauma are shown to have lower attendance, have cognitive impairment, have social dysfunction, have lower test scores. This is data from scientists and research folks, not from me. The results are meaningless for an individual trauma-impacted child, and when you aggregate the results, the aggregated results are meaningless unless you correct for the difference in trauma rates between geographies. All the while, trauma-impacted children's needs are ignored, the elephant in the room. Why is a question for another hearing, and maybe the most important question. Why are we here? Why are we in this position? Events that can become traumatic. Abuse, so we're speaking the same language. Abuse, emotional, physical, sexual. Addiction or mental illness of a household member. Witnessing household violence, neglect, parental absence, whether it's from separation, divorce, or incarceration. There's one or both parents missing is another source of it. In general, you could use the term the terms overwhelmed, helpless, unpredictable, uncontrollable, terror. The research folks use the term sometimes adverse childhood experience and the acronym ACE. The neuroscience of trauma. Let me go back one too fast there. Flight, fight, or freeze survival mode is nature's or the brain's defense. Stress hormones, cortisol, and adrenaline are released. Cognitive functions in the prefrontal cortex are muted to deal with an immediate threat. Academic functions and testing is physiologically impossible. This is science, this is not Daun Kauffman. Ultimately, the physical brain changes. The physical brain changes directly linked to education. The social, there's much more I could share, but I'm trying to keep it under 5 hours. The social defenses. Trauma-impacted children are not bad kids. They're not sick, they're injured. Memory becomes locked in from the trauma, injury. They're on high alert, they're suspicious, and they can go in two directions. Hyper-aroused, aggressive direction, which you hear about the most, but they can also dissociate, which is a psychological splitting from the environment. One that's often ignored, by the way, because they're much quieter. They're very logical defenses based on experience with complex trauma, and they're easily re-triggered. Back to Danny. Danny's parents struggled to find steady jobs and income for their family. They were still dealing with stress from immigration. They moved to a North Philly neighborhood full of crime and drugs. Danny's dad was violently murdered when Danny was very young. During his early years, he was told his dad was away. Danny's mother, Maria, left alone to support 3 children, became despondent and desperate. Drinking and meds dulled her grief and stress. Her own attempts to survive financially led to her incarceration. Danny was left with no parent. His older siblings had a different father who had taken custody while Maria was incarcerated. When she was released, Danny witnessed anger and violence between Mom and now reunited siblings, often, and eventually Maria sent them back to their dad. More sadness and more loss for Danny. All alone with Danny now, Mom confided that his father was not really away, but he had been murdered. And confusion and grief tortured Danny. It was at that point, 8 years of age, that Danny walked into our classroom. Some days at first he seemed resilient. Danny could share a great toothy smile that stretched from ear to ear. He loved learning and sharing about his family's culture. He loved to run, seemingly as free as a bird in those moments. Danny was a talented artist too, at times losing track of his surroundings while he created other worlds on paper. On his good days, Danny's academic ability was on par or ahead of his classmates, and his street smarts were well above average. Those were precious, rare days. Underneath Danny's smile was a learned mistrust of adults and a refusal to attach. Danny's mother was using alcohol again, and he'd been told that dropping or spilling any of his mother's alcohol would result in punishment, standing naked in an extended icy cold shower. His mistrust created misunderstandings with other kids, too. He spent recess alone as often as he joined the others. Danny once told me that his favorite toy and game was guns, so that he'd be practiced and ready when he was able to find his father's killer. Although Danny's chronological age was only 8, his life story was already defined by fear and loss. His hyper-aroused scanning for any threat he might perceive in a classroom created a wall between Danny and the others. His traumas could be re-triggered by a classmate, just a slight shift in position or an innocent look. When his fears were triggered, Danny could go off track quickly with a loud, nervous laugh or a threat yelled across the room. He'd rip up his classwork, throw his books, dump his desk, and run for the hall, screaming with angry tears. His classmates watched, gripped in fear. At other times, Danny kept his panic hidden, emotionally dissociated, maybe drawing or reading something off topic, but experiencing the same fear. At least twice during dissociating, Danny quietly but tensely broke a small plastic pencil sharpener. When confronted, he quickly put a jagged piece on his tongue. And when approached further, he swallowed. On another occasion, he threatened to swallow the loose blade. Our school didn't have other spaces or adults available to allow Danny to de-escalate. I couldn't leave the other 25 plus children to be with Danny. Our counselor was on long-term leave with no replacement. Our school was not staffed with a nurse daily. Maria was informed about the seriousness of Danny's state, and her initial response was to claim that Danny was just having a bad day and to go home and inflict corporal punishment. It'll go away, is what she said. Danny's story, the saddest part of this is that Danny's story is not an aberration. Danny didn't know it, but I could tell you stories from 11 other children in the same classroom. Stories of life full of trauma. But back to the science and research. The initial ACE study, or Adverse Childhood Experience study, had 17,000 participants. It was huge. Mostly suburban, mostly middle class, college educated, mostly white, employed people with health insurance. The findings were stunning. 22% had experienced 3 or more ACEs. Experience significant because 3 or more ACEs correlates with double the risk of depression, double adolescent pregnancy, double lung disease and liver disease, triple the risk of alcoholism and STDs, a 5 times increase in suicide. Let me put that back one too fast there. Sorry. That was in suburban Southern California. There was this urban ACEs study done right here in Philadelphia, with a much more shocking 37% of the population experiencing 4 or more ACEs, tens of thousands of children. If you're conservative, at least 25,000 children. In North Philly, where I live, the prevalence is devastating, 45% with 4 ACEs. These are children, essentially half of them with 4 ACEs. For some scale perspective, I take nothing away at all. In fact, I agree with everything I heard about ELL learners and IEP students. But the ACEs number at 37% on average across the city dwarfs the IEP number at about 10%, the ELL number at about 14%, combined 24% IEP and ELL students. Children with 4 or more ACEs are 37%. That's more than 50% greater than IEPs and ELLs put together. It's the elephant in the room that we don't talk about. It's not a deficit perspective. These children are not bad or sick. They're injured. It's a brain injury that I wish we had more time to talk about. Researchers document many impacts. I could tell you in general, and I'll provide a bibliography if you like. But impacts of 3+ ACEs in the classroom include worse health, lower attendance, more frequent suspension, lower standardized test scores, more frequent designation of special ed, and 250% more likely to be retained in grade failed. So back to the beginning. For trauma-impacted children, it doesn't matter how good the curriculum, doesn't matter how good the teacher, the test design, the cultural fit, the age appropriateness, none of that matters. They're all irrelevant. A developing child's trauma-impacted brain shuts down cognition to deal with the threats they perceive. It's normal. It's nature's way of increasing survival. We won't have a successful education paradigm. I'm going to use the word paradigm, not process, not policy, but a way of thinking about it. We won't even accurately be able to interpret success while ignoring trauma's overwhelming presence, especially in urban areas. I do want to step to the side for a second and say 22% in Southern California is nothing to take lightly either. That's 1 out of every 5 children. So it's not only an urban issue, but it is a much larger urban issue. Conversely, many education reformers, most not having been in our classrooms, are oblivious to the child's injuries and to their continuing fear and stress. Ignoring or not caring, they continue to push and push for more standardization, more testing. They push on, effectively bullying the children, even though the test content itself is in question. You heard it earlier. They bully even though the data says that enduring the test itself adds to trauma. Meanwhile, the test ignorantly masses together all our epidemic numbers of trauma-impacted children with all the other children into one single score for the whole city, for the school and the city, and then misleadingly compares that school to other schools. The numbers give a false sense of reliability, a false sense of reality. The approach is very unsafe for so many of our children. I have a lot more to say about it. In closing, the ultimate injustice is then to classify or to label individual trauma-impacted students like Danny based solely on the results of the test. The process is not safe to Danny. The process is not fair. They cannot equally access their education. They cannot equally access the test. There's one aspect the counselor mentioned that ought to be looked at a lot closer also. Children have a right to be safe when they come to school, in all meanings of that word, and a right to equal access to education. I choose to confront the bully for Danny. Help us, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Whatever happened to Danny?
Danny's 2 grades higher now. He's getting along.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, God bless you for your efforts and for care.